In the freezing winter of 1872, the industrial port town of Harrogate, New York, seemed wrapped in a darkness no gas lamp could drive away. It wasn't just the Atlantic wind or the hunger that gnawed at families still reeling from the Civil War. It was something far worse. Children began disappearing into the dusk, and those who were found carried marks of cruelty, too deliberate, too monstrous for anyone to comprehend. Fear settled over every home. Mothers locked their doors before sundown. Fathers walked their sons to school without a word. Even the church bells rang like warnings. The horror deepened when people realized the predator haunting Harrogate's streets wasn't a man, but a boy, no older than 12, with one clouded, milky eye that made him look more specter than child. His name would echo through generations: Edwin Grayson, the boy with the marble eye. Some called him the Red Imp of Harrogate. Others said he was America's first true child killer, but no one could explain how a boy so young could carry such darkness. This isn't just a tale of his crimes. It's the story of a town forced to face the idea that evil could live in the heart of a child. It's also the story of a justice system struggling to define guilt when innocence wears such a face, and of how neglect and cruelty can twist a soul beyond recognition. Before we step further into Edwin's world, consider this. Can a child truly be born evil, or is evil something they're taught by the world around them? Now let's return to Harrogate, to the flickering street lamps, the clang of shipyards, and the house where Edwin's story began. November 12th, 1860. In a cramped tenement overlooking the docks, Martha Grayson labored through a bitter night to deliver her second son. When the midwife lifted the infant into the candlelight, a hush fell. One of his eyes shone white and opaque, the iris lost under a pale film. The women in the room crossed themselves. The midwife whispered about a curse. Henry Grayson, a dock worker and former Union soldier hardened by war, looked at the child with disgust. "Not right," he muttered, turning away. That moment defined everything that followed. From the start, Edwin knew no warmth. His father returned home each night reeking of tar and iron, his anger always close to the surface. When he looked at his son, he saw only shame. The beatings that followed were not simple punishment. They were deliberate, almost ritualistic, meant to strip Edwin of any sense of worth. Martha, though gentle, fed his confusion with blind love. She whispered to him after each beating, "They don't see you, Edwin. You're special," but her comfort only deepened his isolation. Harrogate saw something else entirely. Children mocked him as Marble Boy, throwing stones in the schoolyard. Teachers, too weary to intervene, ignored him, left alone. Edwin found solace in the cheap violence of penny dreadfuls, stories of scalpings, torture, and frontier bloodshed. Where others read for excitement, Edwin studied. He memorized. He imagined. By 10, he had begun practicing what he read first on stray animals near the docks. Cats and dogs vanished, their bodies later found mutilated. Neighbors suspected the pale-eyed boy, but nothing was proven. Martha defended him. Henry withdrew further. Pain and neglect became Edwin's teachers. His father's hatred showed him how to cause suffering. His mother's protection taught him to excuse it. His peers' cruelty taught him to direct it downward. By 12, he no longer sought affection or approval, only control. The stray animals no longer satisfied him. His gaze turned to those even smaller, more helpless than himself. That winter in the alleys of Harrogate, innocence met its executioner. The boy with the marble eye had crossed the line from victim to predator, and a terrified town would soon discover what true darkness looked like. When confronted, Martha folded her arms and said firmly, "He's lonely. You're mistaking sadness for cruelty." She wanted to believe her son's strange behavior came from rejection, from the ache of wanting friends. But somewhere in the quiet moments when Edwin said nothing for hours, she must have felt it, the unease creeping beneath her motherly love. Edwin was changing. He no longer cried after his father's whippings. He no longer hid in shame behind the schoolhouse. Instead, he watched. When children played in the alleys, he stood at a distance, his clear eye following every move, every laugh, studying who wandered away, who lingered behind, who trusted too easily. It was as though he was rehearsing testing the world before the curtain rose. He practiced words, forced smiles that never quite reached his eyes, tried coaxing smaller children with pebbles or trinkets stolen from his mother's sewing box. When they ignored him, his face would go blank, then dark, as he whispered to himself in the corner. Once a sparrow flew too low in the schoolyard. Edwin caught it, holding it gently at first, until the bird's wings fluttered wildly in his grip. Then, without expression, he squeezed until it went limp. When a teacher demanded an explanation, his answer froze everyone who heard it. I wanted to see what it felt like. From that day on, the other children kept their distance. Even their silence pleased him. He'd discovered a new kind of power, the power to make others afraid. It was something he'd never held in the woodshed or the classroom. It thrilled him. Even his brother Thomas began avoiding him. Once, Thomas walked in to find Edwin pressing pins into a candle, his lips moving soundlessly. The sight made him recoil. "There's something sick in your head," Thomas muttered before slamming the door. Their father, Henry, only grew harsher, convinced his son was a curse made flesh. The beatings became longer, more deliberate, leaving Edwin bloodied and trembling in the dirt. But something had shifted inside the boy. The pain no longer broke him, it forged him. He stopped imagining escape and started imagining revenge. Not against his father, who was too strong, but against someone smaller, weaker, someone he could control completely. He began to rehearse soft words in front of a cracked hallway mirror, practicing how to sound kind. "Come with me," he whispered to his reflection. "It'll be fun. I'll show you something." Each repetition stripped away what little innocence he had left. By the winter of 1871, the lonely, quiet boy had become something else entirely. The cruelty was no longer imagined, it was hunger waiting to feed. Snow blanketed Harrogate that year, muffling the clang of the shipyards. In the narrow streets, children played when the cold allowed their laughter echoing between brick walls. For most, it was a small escape from poverty. For Edwin Grayson, it was opportunity. He'd spent weeks studying which children wandered alone, which trusted easily, which smiled when spoken to. He had everything planned, the words, the place, the moment. It came one gray afternoon when 4-year-old Samuel Turner was sent to fetch bread for his mother. Edwin had watched him, before small, curious, always lingering near the horses. As Samuel passed, Edwin stepped out from a narrow lane and held out a few sugar drops stolen from home. "Do you like candy?" he asked softly. Samuel hesitated, but the sight of sweets made him smile. Edwin crouched, voice gentle. "I know a secret place where we can play. It's warm inside." The boy took his hand. Together they disappeared from the busy street, walking toward the edge of town, to an abandoned shed on Powder Mill Lane. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and rot. But to Edwin, it was perfect. When the door closed, the smile vanished. "Take off your coat," he said. The child froze, confused, but Edwin's tone left no room for questions. What followed was not a child's game. When Samuel was found, hours later, battered and barely conscious, he could only whisper about the boy with the strange eye who had promised candy. The town was horrified, but no one believed the attacker could be a child. They searched for a man, a drifter, anyone but one of their own. And so, Edwin remained free, the secret alive inside him. That night, lying in bed, he replayed Samuel's fear over and over. For the first time, he wasn't the victim, he was the one in control, and he liked it. In the weeks that followed, Harrogate tried to move on, convincing itself the horror was over. But by February of 1872, that illusion shattered. 2 more boys vanished and were later found near the salt marshes alive, but broken, their small bodies covered in welts and punctures. Both described their attacker the same way, a bigger boy, brown-haired, maybe 12, with one cloudy ghost-like eye. The police refused to believe it. A child, they said, could not plan such cruelty. But Edwin's confidence grew. Each act became more deliberate, more experimental. He tried new tools, splinters, rope, even pins carried in his coat pocket. He wasn't just hurting anymore. He was studying, watching how long they cried when they stopped what frightened them most. To him, they were no longer children. They were subjects. Martha began noticing the stains on his sleeves, the tremor in his hands when he came home late. She asked questions, but his quiet smiles silenced her doubts. Deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. Yet denial is a powerful shield, and she clung to it. The town could not. Fear spread through Harrogate. Parents forbade their children to walk alone. Groups formed to escort little ones to school. But by then, the boy with the marble eye had already learned the one truth that would haunt Harrogate forever: fear was power, and he finally knew how to wield it. The alleys that once rang with laughter were now silent, and a name began to move through Harrogate like a chill on the wind. Not Edwin Grayson. No one outside his family yet suspected him. They called the unseen predator the boy with the marble eye. The name spread through taverns and markets, whispered by children who dared each other to speak it after dark. To some, it was just a ghost story. To others, it was too real. Edwin heard the rumors and felt something close to pride. What fear had taken from him, the whispers returned. He had become what his father could never beat out of him. Something powerful, something feared. But being a phantom wasn't enough. The hunger that had driven him since childhood was growing sharper, more restless. What began with Samuel Turner had only whetted his appetite. And as the snows melted into spring, Edwin prepared for an act that would take him beyond pain, beyond control, and into something even darker. By April 1872, the thaw had come to Harrogate, but the air was still heavy with dread. The cobblestones were slick with melting ice ships groaned in the harbor again, and yet fear clung to every household, like frost that refused to melt. That was when Edwin found his next victim, a quiet 7-year-old named Michael Dwyer, the son of an Irish dock worker. For weeks, Edwin had watched him run errands for his mother, small chores that took him just far enough from safety. On the afternoon of April 14th, Edwin stepped from an alley with a smile he had practiced in the mirror and held out a tiny tin soldier stolen from another boy. "Want to see something secret?" he said softly. Michael's curiosity was his undoing. He followed Edwin through the narrow lanes to a rotting storage shed at the edge of the docks. Inside, the air was thick with damp wood and rust. When the door shut, the illusion ended. Edwin's tone hardened. He forced Michael down, bound his wrists with scrap cord, and began what could only be described as an experiment in cruelty. He struck the boy in measured intervals, studying the fear that widened his eyes. Then, in a moment of chilling escalation, Edwin pressed Michael's face into a puddle of stagnant water until his small body convulsed and went limp. Only then did he release him alive, but broken. When dock workers found the child hours later, his skin was blue, his breathing shallow. and when he could speak the first words he whispered, froze the town in terror. A boy with a white eye. Like a marble, panic spread through Harrogate. The people who once imagined a lurking man now faced a new horror. One of their own children was the monster. Fathers took to the streets at night with lanterns and cudgels. Mothers locked their doors tight and prayed. But no one could say where to look, because the boy with the marble eye moved among them unseen, blending into every schoolyard and crowded street. Edwin, meanwhile, was changing again. The drowning had awakened something in him, a fascination with the thin line between life and death. The hesitation that once held him back was gone. The summer of 1872 should have brought peace to the Graysons, but instead it marked their descent into something worse. Henry Grayson, worn down by years of drink and bitterness, vanished one morning and never returned from the docks. For Martha, his absence was both heartbreak and deliverance. She told herself it was a chance to start over, to save her sons from the misery that had poisoned their home. Gathering what little they owned, she moved Edwin and his older brother Thomas across the river to Southmere, a crowded district of immigrants and dock workers. The streets there were alive with noise and color, a place where strangers forgot your name by sundown. To Martha, it felt like hope. "Here you can be different," she told Edwin as they unpacked in their narrow flat on Broad Street. Here, no one knows. But for Edwin, Southmere wasn't a new beginning. It was a fresh hunting ground. No one here knew the stories whispered across Harrogate. No one avoided the boy with the pale, wandering eye. And most important of all, he now understood that his mother would protect him no matter what. She had defended him before. She had moved them rather than face the truth. To Edwin, that meant he could act without consequence. Thomas kept his distance, working long hours selling newspapers and avoiding his brother whenever he could. But Edwin was no longer content to hide. He watched the children of Southmere with the same cold focus he once turned on stray cats. Barely 2 weeks after their arrival, fishermen found the battered body of a young boy washed up on the shore south of town. He lived, but only barely. His wounds, bites, scratches, punctures were so brutal that even the hardened dockmen who found him looked away. The boy's description was simple but unforgettable. A brown-haired child with an eye like cloudy glass. Southmere tried to explain it away, to believe it was an isolated attack. But Edwin knew better. The violence had become personal. In Harrogate, he had used objects to harm. Here he used his own hands, his own teeth. It was no longer just cruelty, it was communion. 3 weeks later, on September 11th, he struck again. The victim was Joseph Kennedy, another boy of 7. Edwin had followed him for days, noting his solitary errands to the corner shop. He lured him to a deserted boathouse on the marsh, using the same soft tone that once fooled Samuel Turner. Inside, Edwin escalated further than ever before. He used a stolen pocket knife, drawing its edge across Joseph's face in thin, deliberate lines. He forced the child's head underwater again and again, pulling him back just before he drowned. This time there was no hesitation, no flicker of conscience. Each cry, each gasp only deepened his fascination. When it was over, Edwin watched the boy's shivering body with quiet satisfaction. He had perfected his craft. Southmere, still unaware of the horror that had crossed the river, would soon learn what Harrogate already knew. The boy with the marble eye did not stop. He evolved. When Joseph was found hours later, coughing up muddy water and bleeding from shallow cuts, he whispered only a few words that sent a chill through every man in the room. A boy. With an eye like a stone. This time the police could no longer hide from the truth. The monster they were hunting wasn't a grown man. It was a child. Still they hesitated, unable to grasp the idea that one so young could commit such acts. Southmere was packed with boys who fit the vague description: brown hair, small frame, but none had that pale, cloudy eye. And Edwin knew how to disappear in plain sight. He kept his head low, avoided the gaze of adults, and melted easily into the crowds. He felt no fear. If anything, the danger excited him. His mother had already uprooted their lives once to protect him. The police hadn't suspected him then, and they wouldn't now. The victims could describe him perfectly, but who would believe children claiming that another child was their tormentor? Each attack made him bolder, and boldness made him sloppy. 6 days after the boathouse attack, railway workers discovered another boy, Robert Gould, tied to a telegraph post near the tracks. His arms and legs were carved with knife wounds. The cuts weren't deep enough to kill, but deep enough to scar. Edwin had been interrupted by approaching footsteps before he could finish what he started. Robert survived and gave the most detailed account yet. He spoke of the cloudy eye, the cruel smile, and the voice that began soft and turned sharp. This time the police had no doubts left. Southmere's predator was a boy. As officers whispered the description among themselves, horror rippled through the town. It defied logic, justice, even the idea of childhood itself. But in the narrow apartment on Broad Street, Martha Grayson didn't need the papers to tell her. She saw the truth every time Edwin walked through the door, his flushed cheeks, his trembling hands, the stains he tried to hide. One evening she finally asked the question she'd avoided for too long. "Edwin," she whispered, "were you there near the marshes? Did you hurt that boy?" He looked at her for a long moment, the lamplight catching the ghostly sheen of his right eye. Then he smiled. Not with innocence, not even with guilt, but with the quiet certainty that she would protect him. Martha froze. Every instinct screamed to go to the police to end this before it grew worse. But denial had become her armor. She told herself that confessing would mean losing him forever. That another move, another new beginning, could somehow fix what had gone wrong. So she said nothing. She smoothed his hair, forced a tremor into her voice, and whispered, "You must stay out of trouble. People talk. They don't see you the way I do." It was a choice that would doom children she'd never meet. In shielding her son, Martha sealed the fate of others. Edwin understood immediately what her silence meant: freedom. If even his mother wouldn't stop him, no one could. He grew reckless, savoring the thrill of walking so close to capture. He lingered longer at his scenes, left traces behind. He realized his control extended beyond his victims. He now held power over adults, their fear, their blindness, their disbelief. But arrogance is a dangerous companion, and soon it would betray him. On the afternoon of September 20th, 1872, Southmere's air was thick with coal smoke and the tang of the sea. Most children were kept close to home now, watched carefully by nervous parents. Yet Edwin drifted near the police station on Main Street, curiosity, or perhaps arrogance, guiding him. He wanted to see what happened after the chaos he'd caused. Peering through a cracked window, his fingers pressed to the glass, he saw a sight that froze even him. Inside sat Joseph Kennedy, the boy he had cut and nearly drowned. The boy was trembling, flanked by 2 officers, recounting his nightmare once more. He described the attacker in detail, the brown hair, the cruel smile, and that ghostly white eye. Then Joseph looked up. His gaze locked on the window. On Edwin. "That's him," the boy screamed, pointing, his voice cracking with terror. "That's the boy. That's the marble eye." The station erupted. Officers rushed outside, shouting, boots pounding against the street. Edwin hesitated for one fatal heartbeat before turning to run, but hands grabbed him, hauling him inside. He didn't resist. When they demanded his name and asked if he was responsible, he answered in a flat, quiet tone that silenced the room. Yes, I did it. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and impossible. The officers who had braced themselves for denial or tears found neither. He was calm, emotionless, as though confessing to breaking a window, not maiming children. One by one his victims were brought in. Some cried, some screamed, but all pointed to him, the boy with the marble eye. There was no longer any doubt. By nightfall, the story had swept across the county. Crowds gathered outside the station, desperate to see the child who had become their nightmare. When Edwin was led out in shackles, people gasped not at some grotesque monster, but at how ordinary he looked. Just a thin, pale boy with tangled hair and a blank stare. Only the eye-white, distant, unblinking, set him apart. That night, the town didn't sleep. Some prayed for justice, others for understanding, but everyone knew something had broken forever. The innocence of childhood had been shattered. By dawn, word had spread beyond Southmere. The courtroom overflowed as people poured in from neighboring towns, farmers, dockmen, mothers, clutching their children to glimpse the marble-eyed boy who had brought horror to their streets. Judge William Forsythe presided over the case with a face as pale as the accused. No one in that room, not even the law itself, was ready to confront what stood before them, a child who had become the embodiment of evil. Judge William Forsythe had presided over countless cases in his career: robbery, assault, even murder. But nothing like this. Nothing could prepare him for the sight of a 12-year-old boy accused of crimes so calculated, so monstrous, that seasoned officers could barely recount them without trembling. When Edwin Grayson was brought into the courtroom in plain clothes, his wrists bound, a hush fell over the crowd. There was no sign of the beast they had imagined. Only an ordinary boy, thin, pale, with the look of someone who might sell newspapers or carry coal. But when he turned his head, the room gasped. The right eye, milky and blind, gleamed under the courthouse light. A whisper passed through the gallery, like wind over glass. The marble eye. The prosecution spoke first, deliberate and precise. They called the surviving victims one by one. Their voices shook, but they spoke the truth. They told of Edwin's charm, his false kindness, the promises of candy and games that turned to terror. They described the ropes, the blades, the suffocating water. And when asked if the boy who hurt them sat in the room, they pointed every single one to Edwin Grayson. When Edwin was questioned, he showed no fear, no remorse. He recounted his crimes with the calm detachment of someone describing an experiment. I wanted to see what it felt like, he said when the judge asked him why. The words sent a gasp through the chamber. Some wept openly. Others shouted curses until the bailiff restored order. Never before had anyone, let alone a child, spoken of cruelty with such dispassion. His defense attorney, Charles Robbins, tried to paint a picture of tragedy. He is but a boy, Robbins pleaded, shaped by a violent father, isolated by deformity, tormented by his peers. How can you condemn a child as though he were a man? Psychologists and doctors testified, debating whether Edwin could understand right from wrong. But the evidence was undeniable. The careful knots, the deliberate wounds, the way he had lured his victims, it all pointed to intention, not madness. Even the judge's hardened expression faltered at the sight of the boy's cold composure. After 2 tense days, the verdict came. Guilty on all counts. Yet the law had no place for a killer so young. He could not be sent to prison with men, nor sentenced to death. So Judge Forsythe delivered the harshest penalty allowed for his age, 6 years at the State Reform School in Westboro. The courtroom erupted. Some shouted in outrage, crying that 6 years was nothing for such evil. Others wept with relief, clinging to the fragile hope that the boy might still be redeemed. Through it all, Edwin remained still expressionless, except for the faint curl of a smile. He knew what the adults did not, that 6 years was not punishment. It was opportunity. When the gates of Westboro closed behind him that autumn, Southmere exhaled as though waking from a nightmare. Parents let their children play outside again. Shops reopened at dusk. They believed the monster was gone. But Westboro was not a prison, it was a laboratory. Built on the belief that no child was beyond saving it, was a place of order and routine. Boys who had stolen or run away were taught discipline, faith, and work. To Edwin, it was theater. He quickly learned his lines. He prayed at chapel, spoke softly to his teachers, answered questions with humility. He excelled in lessons, volunteered for chores, and wore obedience like a mask. A model student, they called him. Remorseful, improved, reformed. But behind the mask, his hunger only deepened. In quiet moments, he filled his notebooks with sketches and words that spoke of pain and power. He remembered the look in his victims' eyes, the way they trembled when the air left their lungs. And as he scrubbed floors and recited scripture, he smiled to himself. Westboro wasn't breaking him, it was perfecting him. He was learning how to deceive, how to manipulate, how to hide the darkness so completely that even the righteous would pity him. Martha Grayson visited, often arms full of food and clothing, her hope unbroken. She pleaded with officials, insisting her son was misunderstood, that he needed only love and guidance. The reports from the schools seemed to agree. By the end of 1873, they declared Edwin rehabilitated. Officials eager to celebrate their success story recommended early release. And so in February of 1874, at just 14, Edwin Grayson walked free. He returned to Southmere, taller, quieter, and far more dangerous. The marble eye still clouded his face, but now he used it as part of his disguise, a symbol of pity rather than fear. His mother welcomed him, with tears convinced her prayers had been answered. To neighbors, he was a changed boy, helping at his mother's small dressmaking shop on Broad Street. He greeted customers, politely swept floors, smiled when spoken to, but inside the hunger roared back to life. It had been starved for nearly 2 years, and now it demanded release. The restraint he had mastered at Westboro made him even more deliberate. He was no longer the impulsive child of Harrogate. He was something worse: patient, practiced, and ready. March 18th, 1874. The chill of early spring lingered in Southmere. Martha's shop was busy that morning, filled with women dropping off mending and collecting finished garments. Behind the counter stood Edwin, his voice soft and courteous. Around midday, a bright-eyed 10-year-old girl named Catherine Katie O'Neill skipped down Broad Street clutching a few coins in her palm. She had saved for weeks to buy a small notebook for school. Her mother had told her to visit Mrs. Grayson's shop, cheap, honest, and close by. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. Edwin looked up. For weeks, he had been waiting. His restraint stretched thin, his thoughts returning to the dark thrill of control. Katie smiled at him, innocent and unguarded. He returned it with a warmth that fooled everyone. What happened next, no one witnessed. His mother worked in the back room, distracted by the hum of her sewing machine. Edwin led Katie downstairs to the basement, perhaps with a promise of paper, perhaps a small favor. No one knows the words he used, only that the door closed behind them. Katie O'Neill never left that shop alive. What we do know is that once below ground, surrounded by the shadows and the bitter smell of coal ash, Edwin's fragile restraint finally broke. He killed her there in the basement beneath his mother's shop. How exactly, no one ever learned. Some believed he used a knife. Others whispered that he strangled her in silence. Whatever the method, it ended the same way: swift, quiet, absolute. 10-year-old Katie O'Neill, whose laughter once filled Broad Street, was gone. For Edwin, the act itself was not the problem, it was what came after. He had never killed before, and now he faced a new question: how to hide it. Working in a fevered rush, he clawed through the heap of old coal dust and ash piled in the corner, the remnants of winter's fires. He buried Katie's small body beneath it, pressing the soot tight with trembling hands. It was crude but effective. When he was finished, the basement looked undisturbed, just another patch of blackened refuse in a working-class home. That evening, when Katie failed to return, panic spread through Southmere. Neighbors searched the alleys and docks, shouting her name into the wind. The police went door to door questioning shopkeepers along Broad Street. When they reached the Graysons, Edwin greeted them calmly. He said Katie had stopped by, bought some paper and left. Martha backed him up, her voice firm but nervous. Whether she lied knowingly or out of blind love, no one could say. Lanterns swung through the basement as officers inspected the piles of ash. But to their eyes it was nothing more than coal waste. Edwin stood beside them, feigning concern, even suggesting other places they might search. Days passed and the O'Neill family's hope turned to despair. Posters went up. Search parties scoured the riverbanks. Mothers prayed over their sleeping children. But the truth lay just beneath the Grayson shop floor. And Edwin, having crossed the line he'd long dreamed of, felt nothing but exhilaration. He had killed, hidden the evidence, fooled everyone. He was untouchable. The weeks that followed were eerily calm. Southmere held its breath, waiting for answers that never came. Martha's shop stayed open. Edwin stood behind the counter, polite, soft-spoken, his composure unnerving. Neighbors admired his quietness, unaware of the horror beneath their feet. But Edwin's hunger had only grown. Killing had given him something intoxicating, a sense of godlike control. And once he'd tasted that power, he couldn't live without it. On April 22nd, 1874, he found his next victim. 4-year-old Horace Miller was a cherubic child with golden curls, the youngest son of a dock worker's family. That afternoon, neighbors saw him in the alley behind his tenement, speaking with a taller boy, brown-haired, polite, with one cloudy, colorless eye. No one thought twice. Edwin led the boy away with promises of candy and a secret game, walking him past the crowded markets and out toward the salt marshes of Dorchester Bay. As the city's sounds faded, Edwin's calm dissolved into something feral. He stripped the child of his coat and shoes, cutting shallow X-shaped wounds into his arms and legs, marks that seemed almost ritualistic. He pressed the boy's face into the marsh water again and again, drawing out each scream, each gasp, studying it like a lesson. When Horace finally stopped struggling, Edwin made the act final, a single violent slash to the throat. But even death did not end his cruelty. The body was mutilated, desecrated, burned in a pit of reeds, as though he wanted to erase not just life, but innocence itself. The next morning, fishermen stumbled upon the charred remains. What they found silenced even the most hardened men. Word spread quickly. Crowds gathered at the shoreline, horrified by what they saw. The newspapers called it an atrocity beyond comprehension. For the first time, the police could no longer deny the truth. The boy with the marble eye was real, and he was killing again. When they searched the Grayson home, the evidence spoke for itself. Scratches on Edwin's arms, blood on his shirt, and boot prints that matched those found in the marsh. When confronted, Edwin didn't cry, didn't beg. He only shrugged. When shown the broken body of Horace Miller, he looked down and said, almost idly, "I suppose I did." The room went silent. And then, almost as an afterthought, he began confessing to more children from Harrogate, from Southmere, even beyond. The number he claimed was unthinkable. The police dismissed it as fantasy until they searched the basement. There, beneath the mound of ash and coal dust, they found Katie O'Neill. Her small skeleton was still curled where he had left her. By winter, Southmere's grief had turned to fury. December 1874 brought one of the largest trials in the state's history. The courthouse overflowed. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath fogging in the cold air. Women wept behind handkerchiefs. Reporters filled every bench, their pencils scratching as if to keep up with history itself. And at the center of it all sat Edwin Grayson. 14 years old, his pale hands folded neatly on the table, his expression serene. He had grown taller in jail, his voice deeper, but his face still carried the softness of a child. Only the milky eye betrayed what he truly was. The boy who had haunted Harrogate and Southmere now faced judgment at last. But as the crowd looked upon him, one dreadful thought settled over them all. Evil had never looked so ordinary. To many in the packed courtroom, that was the most terrifying sight of all. The contrast between the boy's fragile, youthful face and the unspeakable cruelty tied to his name. The prosecution's case was relentless. They mapped out every detail with surgical precision: how Katie O'Neill had been lured into the Grayson dress shop, murdered and buried in the basement ash; how little Horace Miller had been taken to the marshes, tortured, killed, and desecrated. Rope fibers, blood stains, boot prints, they laid it all bare. Survivors from Harrogate and Southmere spoke through tears, describing Edwin's calm voice, his charm that turned cold, the sudden shift from friendliness to horror. Piece by piece, the image became impossible to deny. This was not madness without reason. This was cruelty by design. The jury sat in near silence as Edwin's own words were read aloud from his confession. "I suppose I did." Just 4 words delivered without remorse that seemed to chill the air in the chamber. His attorney, Charles Robbins, did what he could. He spoke of the boy's age, of his brutal father, of the bullying that had twisted him. He argued that Edwin was a product of torment, not a willing monster, that no child could truly grasp the weight of such evil. Experts testified about brain defects, about the milky eye, about the stunted moral growth of an abused child. But the evidence, the ropes, the knives, the careful concealment told another story. Edwin had not lashed out blindly. He had planned, lured, and deceived. That was not insanity. That was intent. The jury deliberated only briefly. When they returned, their verdict was clear: guilty of first-degree murder. The law left no room for mercy. Judge Horace Gray, his voice unsteady, pronounced the sentence death by hanging. The courtroom erupted. Some cried out in grief, others in grim approval. Mothers wept openly. Fathers shouted that justice had finally been done. Yet beneath the noise, unease settled like dust. To hang a child, no matter how monstrous, felt like crossing a line no society was meant to cross. For the next 2 years, as Edwin waited on death row, the nation argued over what should become of him. Politicians, priests, and newspapermen debated the same impossible question: could justice be served by killing a boy? Or would doing so only make the world more like him? In 1876, the governor made his decision. Edwin Grayson's sentence was commuted. He would not hang. Instead, he would live out his days in solitary confinement at Charlestown Prison. At 16 years old, Edwin entered a cell barely 6 feet by 8. A cot, a bucket, a single narrow shelf. That was his world. For decades he remained there, growing from boy to man, to relic of his own legend. His body weakened, his eye clouded completely, but his mind stayed sharp. He built crude tools, plotted escapes, and once, during a failed attempt to break free, partially blinded himself with an improvised explosive. He studied relentlessly languages, philosophy, even law, filling notebooks with essays on justice and punishment. He petitioned for release dozens of times. None were granted. Through all those years, Edwin never once expressed regret for what he had done. Not for Katie O'Neill, not for Horace Miller, not for the others whose names never made the papers. To every chaplain and doctor who questioned him, his answer was the same calm indifference he had shown in court. He saw his actions not as crimes, but as curiosities, things to be observed, not repented. When he finally died in 1932, nearly 60 years after his conviction, Edwin Grayson was 74 years old and completely blind. He died alone in a hospital ward for the criminally insane. There was no funeral, no visitors, no name carved into the earth above him. His body was lowered into an unmarked grave behind prison walls. The boy with the marble eye, whose shadow had once darkened 2 towns, left the world as he had lived in it, unwanted, feared, and alone. But his story did not die with him. In the years that followed, his name resurfaced in courtrooms, in medical journals, and in moral debates across the country. Lawmakers cited his case when arguing whether children could ever be tried as adults. Psychiatrists dissected his life in search of the moment where innocence had curdled into evil. And still the same questions lingered. Was Edwin Grayson born a monster, or made into one by cruelty and neglect? Can a society truly protect itself from what it cannot bear to understand? In the end, Edwin Grayson's legacy was not just written in the graves he filled, but in the unease he left behind, a haunting reminder that sometimes the face of evil belongs to a child.